다들인 건조 디버틸렌 지에체 미카지 다든다 탱솜싱 건조 계지시에 중송아 미유순조 고데 가진 가지 계지 중으로 다 대단 제베 당봉은 디버틸렌 디와 유니지 송로나시다.
So today we'll do mostly questions and answers, and if anyone has any questions concerning the thing that we have been discussing for the last 3 meetings, which was about how to keep the aim or the goal in mind. If you have any questions regarding that, so please let's do that first.
Good evening. So in the other teaching, we talked about developing a recognition that the aggregates are a basis for suffering. And I think in some other classes with Atisha, we sort of talked about having an idea that there's also within those a basis for us to progress on the path. But then maybe a danger of that leading us to ignore that the aggregates are a basis for suffering. So, but it seems to me that if we don't feel that there's anything in our aggregates that can help us go further on the path, then that can be discouraging.
마이크 돌리시죠.
가상계기 먼저 등에 된바 도서기 시디 공부를 된대지 조레스. 네 가상가서 되고 졸랭 나올라요. 본복이랑 신동에 된바 이나양 본본 나올로네 양코랑 람깅 오버 타야기 시담 본이네지 요레스 기케제된 삼삼된 등도스 디용두 더코랑기 같은 슈에디 케싱 아주 본보 등에기 라시인 바 갸시갸담 바 등에기 라시인 바 드rum나 아니 단다 레와 갸압사다 람깅 오버 타와다 냠수 랑고야기 시디 메바 차드로네 어디 셈슈 차야기 냥가셔도스 어디 용도 디칸디 나스까
네. 다 단단 간주 단다 풍부디 두겐 소소라 미드비 총디에 동에 탐지기 시디체 자와소로체 소소 풍부 단단 간주 풍부디 동일기 시 규리야데 동일기 시 간데스니 규르바레 동일기 시드 자와 차야데 간데스니 차바레스 라바이나 콜레다 녀몽기 샤왕도 투버 송자 디김생기 동의기 시트 싸워 차대버지 송자 따탄당 가지고 풍부 매바 속으로 슬라비움디 풍부 매바 속에기 미유 송거래 슬라비가라 풍부 라와당 가지고 로라 가리 차고 슬라바이나 레다 녀몽기 샤왕도 규르 풍부디 매바 속으로스 다 레다 녀몽기 샤왕도 규르 풍부 매바 소단디 레뉴기 샤왕도 단단하죠 풍부 레뉴기 샤왕도 규르데바디 아니 림기 람곰도기 남시기세 아니 레더 녀몽기 샤왕도 규르무고베 토네 레뉴기 샤왕도 송무고베 토네 나란솔로 풍부지 주비용 그래 디 풍부디기 균다마손디 다당하죠 풍부디래 페나 다당한조기 넘버시아바디 코랑고 셀시 릭바 셀점 릭점기 다니 레데 이네 다당 안주기 세점 릭점기 다니기 어디 녀몽기 레지 녀몽기 레 아니 레기 참줄치네 로디기 여바 송자 둥이기 풍보레스 다당 아주 디슈도 거봐 다 남시기 세 아니 레지기 녀몽디 파 매버 소요소나 티닝 안주기 셈디 둥이기랑 신리 줘버봐 디 내급기 아니 셈디 고 림베코 상로 신체 딱 한달 나바 탐지신 비시 중고를 교회에 여버디 아주 흉리 송만 하신 디르봐 손상 아주 셈 세점 릭점기 당이 대라 감대버시비 닝보세제 상기기 릭스제 맹따기 요래 간도 디시시비 닝보세제 아주 맹따기 요래 디 아주 상기기 살을 겨루고 요래 손상 아주 풍부 매바 쇠스 랍두간라 풍부 매바 쇠에게 sam로 깨지시 윤디 리닝기 샤완징기 풍부 매바 쇠스 다 리닝기 샤완징기 풍부디 단다 리닝기 샤완징기 풍부 임발라 코란기 균치말라 레드 녀몽기 샤완도 마송와지 아주 소토와 제고를 디 소위 녀모델라 풍부디 둥이기 시체발리 철와지다
So right now, the base of whatever suffering or any form of suffering that we experience is our aggregates. But the fact that this is the case is because they have become the base of our suffering. And the reason why they have become the base of our suffering, or what has made them the base of our suffering right now, is that they have been created by, or they are under the power of, under the influence of karma and affliction. And so when we say we have to make the aggregates, or we have to get rid of the aggregates, the thing that should come to mind is that you have to get rid of the aggregates that have been created by karma and afflictions. And so when you do that, then gradually when you attain an aggregate which is not created by karma and affliction, since that's the goal, what we have right now is just the continuum that will become that in the future. For example, we say the nature of the mind is clear and knowing, but as it is right now, this clear and knowing mind is tainted by the afflictions, and the afflictions that have continuously acted create those actions or that karma that continues to keep it tainted by the afflictions. Someday, through practice, when you are able to remove those obscurations or remove whatever taints the mind, then you attain the result of Buddhahood, but that happens gradually through the practice of the path that gradually removes those. Based on that, that's why we call right now in the text, you refer to the clear and knowing aspect of the mind as Buddha nature, or it is the Rik. What do we call Rik? It has the lineage of the Buddha or Buddha nature. But the reason why it becomes, why it is called Buddha nature or it is called the lineage of the Buddha, is because when you can remove the things that are obstructing it or the things that are tainting it, then it can transform through the practice of the path into a mind that is no longer of that kind. And so this is the same continuum. Similarly, the aggregates we have now, they are the same continuum that through the progressive practice of the path, as we remove the karma and the afflictions, then we get rid of this state of aggregates that are created by or under power of karma and affliction. So what we have now is the continuum of what later will become the aggregates that are freed of karma and affliction. So that's when we say we have to get rid of the aggregates, or this is what we're trying to work on. That's how it's referred to. It's the aggregates that are created by karma and affliction.
Pena 당당하저 ጼ디기 수기 풍부시도와 뒤둥에 되면 마임버 쇠요 말. 고 레드 니몽기 넘버 쉐바 델라 참자르시 간데 레드 니몽기 펜샤바시 다간데 레기 펜샤바시 인디 디케와디 마조 바도 가조 풍부디 동에 된 방어를 떼디기르다 당아조 단다 가리체 두그랬었나 양결 15도 양직계국이요래 15도 넘버 쉐바 규마 쉐바시지 리고치만 참자르기래 참조로 용도 참조로의 규디 아니 니몽 멤버직 차고 멤버직 디스토바 있나 아니 넘버 쉐베 풍부 사왈렌도에게 풍부 대당 텔라 슈디기 넘버 쉐바 니부디 둥에데모 많이 버차르다
So, when you talk about the form or the body that we have of this life, to try and conceive or try and think that this body that you currently have, it can be rectified or it can be fixed and not made of the nature of suffering is not possible, because the body as it is right now has been propelled or it has been created, and so its nature is determined as being of the nature of suffering. You can't do anything about that, you can't fix it. What you can do is that when one dies or one undergoes the process of death, then there comes a moment when something makes the mind connect to another birth, and so there's something that makes you take on another birth. And if the thing that is making you connect to the next life or take on another birth is an affliction or it's a state of attachment, then you just go through the entire process again. So when you say what can you do and how can you act, the only thing that you can do is that you can ensure that at the time of death, the condition that is making you take on or carry forward is not an afflicted state, but it is a non-afflicted state. By doing that, you can ensure that it doesn't connect onto another state of suffering.
손자 치미 풍부 넘버 쉐바 치미 풍부는 인삼 조례디 니몽 매바직다 아니 사제기 레기 펜바직 매바 소토바이나 아니 풍부 류직 렌이 렌토그세 텐디 류데라 아주 남주 쇼나로 이류세제 강더 둥이기 땡치기 요말 텐디기 풍부디 강라 아니 나위 둥에 가위 둥에 세계지디 셰사 요말에.
So if at that time of death what you have which is connecting the mind or the consciousness to the next life is not afflictions or is not something that is a contaminated karma, then the fact that it is going to connect to some next life and some next state, subsequent state, and therefore also a subsequent body is inevitable. But what's connecting it or what's steering it in that direction, if it's not the afflictions and it's not contaminated karma, then what you take or the body that you take it's called as a body that is the nature of the mind, and that body is no longer a base for suffering, so it doesn't have to experience the suffering of birth, aging, sickness and death.
다 풍부 둥에 대마 임바 셰바디기 심주 차기 말디 좀린디기 둥에 셰바를 차서 풍부도 둥에 대마 임바 셰바를 차서 디 셰바이나 원이 제바이나 심슈 차야기 잡라 심슈야 버기르 오 단단히 풍부도 둥에 된바 임바인디 땅에 둥에 된바 마임바지 풍부지 두고 제고도 와 세게 또 둥에 풍부딩이 가르치는 데 냐고래 둥에 인딩이 풍부디 가르치냐고 딩일로 따제 아 둥에기 때문에 풍부딩지 두고도 세게 디초라 심슈야 빠레라 고 펜도요다 둥에 셰바디게.
So contrary to the idea that realizing that we have aggregates that are the nature of suffering or the base of suffering, which then acts as like a demoralizing or a demotivating factor, it's quite the opposite, because the second you realize that the aggregates are the base of suffering, what you also realize simultaneously is that you can therefore take on an aggregate that is not of this kind. And so instead of feeling demotivated or deflated, you feel motivated because you realize and you just understand that I don't want this, I have to ensure that I can take on something else, and I can take on something else, so why should I get fixated with this? I'll strive or work to attaining something different.
다 심슈 차야디 가리기 짜기를 슬라바이나 풍부 등에 대한 바 시에제 다 등에 대한 바 마힘비 풍부직 두버 제국도 라윤디 아니 레더 녀몽기 샤원도 마당왜 풍부직 두버레스 라윤디 다 녀몽 가고로 봐 수저 녀몽 가고 요바인디 녀몽 가토야 미도와 녀몽 세도 고 셈게랑 신 코론라 도와 세지 디 삼로도 코바이나 아니 오늘 셈슈샤 그렇다.
So if at all something can demotivate you, what could demotivate one is that you think that you want to attain a state that is not of these aggregates or not like these aggregates that are propelled by karma and afflictions. And then when you see whether it's possible or not, if you come to the conclusion or you believe that the afflictions are of the same nature of the mind, and therefore they are an inherent quality of the mind, then that is a real reason for being demotivated.
다 디고를 남샤 게바디 제망아주 롭센남 튕기레데 단다 주루비 두다모 카지기 아니 착바세 셈기 랑신이 바지 셈기 랑신 임바인데 치시 셈요바 티시도고 로이 나로라 고 착바디 용용 바인 바지 고 착바세디 고 매바 수해 매바지 계지시기요 다디 군주 두다나나 셰브나 슝무빈니줄라 딘디 착바세지 고 매바 수해 매바지 임바이나 다 셈주 차야라레다.
So it'll come later when we study, but now also just to bring it up, there are certain schools that believe that attachment is inherent or like an intrinsic quality of the mind. You cannot separate attachment from the mind. They're not inseparable. And so when they have this vision that it's not separable, there's nothing that you can do. You can't really act to try and remove attachment from your mind. And if what they're saying is true, and that is actually the nature of the mind, then that is a legitimate reason to feel demoralized.
Buddhist schools?
Other schools, there's some other philosophical schools, not Buddhist, yeah.
다 남바 상계베 아니 덴데기 ngobenesuela 아니 녀몽세의 셈게랑 신라 매바시 다디 줍난게 요래 디마 줍용디 안 페체가 잡이 남디 리우니베 나로라 셈게랑 신 외세고 디만남네 루부와세지 셈게랑 신라 디메레 매바 디마생에 디고 루부르구소도 도스 여대바시 다디 빼텔라 아니 야케베소게 니메 랑신 코론 아니 왜 세와다 덴데기 랑신 임바시 아니 팅버세디 니만라 파 딥딩이 팅버세고 루부르도 코르데바시 거기 겐 하소기 왕기 루부르도 텔라 코르데바시 마도 니메 랑신 코론의 팅비에 슈그메바시 베덴데 자주 송만나시 ngazu semteya time timatamji tele rangshin le medeba luburu sudu yodebashi di yindu ko ani terong yimbashi ta luburu sudu yoba yindu ko terong yimbashi ta lubu yin nang de shi tanda shu mo che ko di de terong yoba di de terong yoba yindu ani ngazu sem number sheba 풍부를 참조라디 녀몽기 레메고 바지 ngazu 수해요 di suhe yoba yina ani dungi dema mayi 풍부직 두베요
Whereas the Buddhist schools, they speak of the afflictions as not pertaining to the nature of one's mind. So the nature of the mind itself is not tainted or does not have the afflictions as part of its nature. And so Acharya Dharmakirti in his second chapter, when he describes what the nature of the mind is, he says the nature of the mind is clear light, and the obscurations are adventitious. And the example that is given by many masters is that the nature of the mind is like the sun, which is clear, and even though the clouds might temporarily or in an adventitious manner kind of cover the sun, which prevents you from seeing its clarity, the clouds are not of the nature of the sun. And because they're adventitious and not of the nature of the sun, they can be separated from the sun. Similarly, the afflictions and the obscurations are not the nature of the mind, they're adventitious. Now the meaning of adventitious and what that means, we won't do that now, we don't need to discuss that now. But basically what it means is if it is adventitious, and it is true that they're adventitious, then it's possible to attain a state where you can separate and they can be removed from the mind.
지워신 바.
네.
So I'll direct this to Atishaji, to you. So Adina Keshilaji mentioned that in the last session, the direct realization of emptiness. If you realize that, then only you can be able to benefit others. So the illustration of that was given as a suitable Sangha, the third refuge. And it was also mentioned that until you attain the state of Arya Sangha, you are not in a situation to benefit others. So my question is that as bodhicitta and wisdom of emptiness are the two wings, to my mind, compassion and altruism are also the two wings to cultivate bodhicitta. So if you are not reached that state of Arya Sangha and you are cultivating, unless you practice, you won't be able to cultivate it. And if you're not cultivating it, and if you're practicing it, is this really not beneficial? Is it really not adding up to what you're doing?
Beneficial to others, you mean?
Beneficial to others.
Okay.
So when compassion and altruism, when you're doing it for benefit of others, is it really counting that way, or you need to reach the state of Arya Sangha?
Gela, tanda kasangi ki ngazu kyab gi doing gi kyab chayala pabe khansa gore to ngosun to be shirab gyunen gi khansa gores. Ta di endu to toni to be gyunen gi toni ngosun to be gyunen gi pabe gi nu chawala ale dam su sonam gi cho ta yishi gi cho tab ta shiram ni ga la pa jang ne ting or la gyur gores. Ta tab ta shiram ni ga jang be cham de la ta tab jang yondu ani changju gi sem ta ninji chenbo da champagne gi sem di jangur. Ta pabe gomang mathog gi ngola tab ki cha da champagne gi lo da shen la pembe chawa juk de di shen la pengi marwes kaje nga zo kyob di shine toni gosun do do shine kansa ducha kyo ya da ducha la ma duye gi keche chik kansa tiros ta di ngola chesha gi di khares.
당한조 가장 쉬운 시 신된스 라바 인도 신된디 신주기 냥대체 냥대체 단 냥대기 시고죽사디 아니 당부 고죽사 당부디 도망밤에 꼭된들 다 도망밤에 꼭바시 딘디 신이 아니 고망밤에 꼭발래 인도 냥대 차버와 다디 인도 먼저 신된 셰스 라바이나 딱 강사 파로보 랑리 유타데베 강사 시엔직 냥데기 살고야 다 냥데기 고축사 당보디 토만밤에 꼭와인디 아니 꼭대는 거야 들어가다 디 아주 신도 쳐야 되다 신도 쳐야 된다 뒤로보다 다디 고단디 간데르슬라나 ngani 추송네 고에르마도 셴바 탑랑카야게 뭐 가진 롱창바 임바 춘이 덴바 덴베 초바 줄세지 뒤로봐 다 단다 ngaso럽지 나랑 고공원도 제매바 인디 니 ngani 최 가주주 송바 이나야 계란조 고고살로 끄두고 말이야 디땡케 봤다 nga 냥딩군도 제매바 인디 니 최송바 디기 계란조 쓰들 냥데기 살로 끄두고 그랬으나 끄두고 말이야 다 디니 마마마마 밥침바 이나 게딩이 니 돈이 또 매워서 니 돈이 가지고 시야바이네 계란 돈이 또 버지 써두고 말이 돈이도 비쌀 거두고 말이 딴니 줄에 잠닝지 장주기 쌤 매바이나 장주쌤 매바 손사 니 잠닝지 장주기 쌤 가지고 시야바이나야 계란 잠닝지 장주기 쌤 비쌀 거두고 말이다 소소다 마마마도 밥이 나르다 소소다 밥이 고방 마토기 바도 신된 제 고마점 스타 신된 제 고마점 세디 아주 펜도 장아 중에 끼지지요 봐. 딜시기요 말. 딜시기요 말. 다 단단 예지 최로 단단 예지 마디니 지 셰제. 디기토는 결혼도 최주 고와지라 가리니 지라. 디코 딜가도 남비 펜도 셰스다 라비로 바디. 딘디 펜도 메바디 마르와. 따이는 가도 펜도 고마디 고발로 끄고 봐. 소송 고발로 끄고디 고발로 수익도 그랬으나 고봉운도 생긴 강사지기 아니 ngani 템베 식디기 계란 고바살로 끄도 그래. 딜다.
So returning to what we had said last time, we had said that benefiting others, or the benefit of others, is to be understood as their liberation. So the liberation that others have attained. The first level of liberation, and liberation is cessation, right? It's the cessation of afflictions. The first stage where you have the first level of cessation is when you attain the path of seeing, because there you have the cessation of the obstructions that are to the path of seeing. After that, then you have the obstructions that are to the path of meditation, which when you remove, you have complete cessation of the afflictions and nirvana. So when we have said that benefiting others is, when we have identified the benefit of others as their liberation or the cessation that they attain, then your action of benefiting someone else is one's ability to lead them to attain that state of cessation. And if yourself, you're not resting in that state of cessation, or you yourself haven't attained it, whatever you say, whatever you do, is not going to make the other person actually attain that state. So for example, in my case, I am talking to you, whatever I might say to you, even though because I haven't attained liberation, or I haven't attained the path of seeing, whatever I may say, however helpful or good it might be, it's not able to take you to that state of cessation. Then if you come further down, because I haven't realized emptiness and because I haven't generated bodhicitta, whatever I may say, it's not going to enable you to realize emptiness, nor is it going to enable you to generate bodhicitta, because I don't have that ability myself. So when we say, until you have direct realization of emptiness, don't work for the benefit of disciples, we're not talking about any kind of ordinary, temporary benefit. That, of course, you can do. There's no harm in doing that. So, for instance, my speaking or telling you and being of benefit to you, of course, is beneficial. It's not like it's not beneficial. But when you identify benefiting others as their attainment of cessation, until you yourself have attained that state, whatever you may say, whatever you may do, it will not be able to communicate it in a manner where it will be able to enable the other person to attain that state. That's why it says that.
다 나랑 초르와 여대바 녜바 여대바디 가리여스라나 녜중기 삼바 요 말때 이네 녜중기 삼바디 아니 타르베기 규임바 장주기 셈 귤레메나야 장주기 셈디 장주기 셈 마신 친절로 남진기 규 멤바치 다 동익이 따와 매바 이나 간다 타람 간다 타르버 드제기다 람친이 다 바신이바디 매딩이지 디 네반이다 네반이 되게 서로지 여르다 하람 여르다 이 서로지 여르다 소자다 디 여반인디 디 네반이바 니 결혼을 소도 그랬다 소자다 디 네반이바 가지고 니 결혼을 소도 그래 손자 가지고 단다디 랍데기 미유디 소용도 코란에 결혼서 타르바살라 고에디다 니 제토고만 가지고 제토에 말해 띵 가지고 미유 말해 가지고 미유 가르라나 남바상기비 최세디 남바상기비 최세디 가리 이미 디 결혼서는 니신 예와진 가지고 소위 가지고 미유 띠르다 남바상기비 남기 고 가르래 남기 고 만으로와 가르래 람 차상와 가르래 람기 고림 가르래 디 니신 예방 가지고 결혼서는 소위 인세고 가지라나 디 로망 링라 칼리갑세 소소라 디 니시도 중대버지 디 결혼서 따다 가지고 쇠도 그래 당 가지고 미두스 미 라브르 미유나 두스 당 가지고
So what experience or what certainty can I say I have? I can't say I have generated renunciation. But what I can say is that I am certain that without renunciation, one doesn't have the cause for liberation, and when there is renunciation, one has the cause for liberation. This certainty I have. Similarly, I have also the certainty that without bodhicitta, one doesn't have the causes for Buddhahood, and if one has bodhicitta, then one has the causes of Buddhahood. And the other certainty that I can say I have, it might not be accurate to say I have it, but that's something that I think I have, a certainty that these three are, and it's okay to say that I have that, is that without emptiness, one cannot attain the path to liberation. And if one has understood emptiness, then one can cultivate the path to liberation. So the certainty that this is the case is a certainty that I can say I have. And so that's why when I say that our aim over here of this school is not to lead you to the path of liberation or to lead you to liberation, because we don't have that and I don't have that and I haven't attained it. What I can say is the aim of such is setting up this institute is to make you have the same certainty that I have. And so of the many years that we have all studied and thought and contemplated and reflected on it, we currently have this certainty about what the correct understanding of the path is, what the sequence of that path is, and how to progress along that sequence. Since that is the certainty that we have, our aim over here is to make you understand, or at least convey to you and generate the same certainty in you of what the aim of the path is, what the nature of the path is, and what the order to proceed along that path is. Because this is a certainty that I have after having worked and reflected and studied over the many years. So that's the aim that we have here.
Chuhoje bande adisha selling lungbala mape kongla yagana shubi kadula nalinda shubi kadula pendida chumbor pendida gi singyen top sabr tene nangbi da 태고 shujung shung 통자 퇴제 춤부 시라르다 항상 이 kenja 춤부 된들 다 태고 춤부 남기 주고 장주기 셈 임바 장주기 셈 매나 아니 남부 탐지심이 고방다 토에 매버디 공기 캔버다 킹기요다 킹기요르데 이네 디 귤게 두고요 말다 냠낸 지기요르데 귤게 두고요 말에 가질라나 딘디기 장주기 셈 귤로파 그행게다 개비신이 딱딱 장주기 셈 명예 톤 두귤 퉁딩에 개겐지 마체버인데 디기 가제 디인데 아니 코랑기 꿀리망보 괜시 셀링 룸발 페이지 라마 셀링 버 샤블로 뚜그르와 균제 가르서나 라마 셀링 버 두귤라 장주기 셈 퉁차르 퉁사바 인데 장주기 셈 두귤 퉁상이 지기 아니 코랑기 냠용 용화디 마송용도 가서 셴바데라 장주기 셈 귤음 마케브 깨버 제투고 요르다 균제 투사 디르다 셴콩 덴데 꿀리망보 괜시 파게 패고 해 되면도 와
So when you think of Dipankar Atisha, he, in his efforts to go and study with his Guru Serlingpa, when he made that arduous journey, before leaving, Atisha was already extremely learned Pandita, both in the texts of the Pali canon and the Sanskrit canon, and he was widely renowned as an extremely wise and learned master, and also someone who had complete certainty in the necessity of bodhicitta as an entry into the Mahayana path and a cause to attain Buddhahood. But this certainty that he had was not transforming into actually generating bodhicitta within his own mind. And even though he was wise and learned in all the things, the reason why he couldn't generate bodhicitta was because he hadn't met a teacher who themselves had generated this mind. So if that was to happen within someone as wise and learned as Atisha, it would obviously require someone who themselves had it. And that's why Atisha made such effort collecting all of the riches and all of the resources required and making that long trip back then to Indonesia to go and meet Serlingpa and spend many years study there. The reason why Serlingpa was capable was because he himself was someone who had generated bodhicitta, and having attained that, or having that realization, he was able to make it arise in people who did not have it yet. Otherwise, if you think about it, what reason would be there for Atisha to go through such enormous effort, considering who he was, what he knew, if it wasn't for trying to meet someone who could make him generate the mind of bodhicitta?
So that the Indu Ngazola combat Tangbudi Ngazo Karelana, combat Tangbudi, Nijun Shansen Yang Tabe Tawa Sombodi, 람기 쪼 세디 임바디 녀신예바 소그래 디간서 공부 당보르다 다디 녀신예 차비 제라 다디 귤 깨나마도 탑민도 세게 다디 귤 마게베 깨베 제고도 세게 셈 딩네 되냐기 dum바질레 용디 테니 니중 귤 깨디 겐기 라마 게비신예 차주기 셈 귤 깨디 겐기 라마 게비신예 똥니기 따와 귤 깨디 겐기 라마 게비신예 지기 샤블 똥네 아니 디 담가디니 소수용원에 곰 지비 제바체 디 도체제 아니 소수규라 남기 좋은 넘버 숨부디 귤게 해다 디 콤바니 버다 디 콤바니 버다 도체바이나 가 투사다버디 단도 투사다버디 가서 가리 툭디고 벌써나 니중 장생 양답이 따와 숨부디 남기 좋이임바 디 가서 예바만이 버시지 하나 가서 가서 디 가되고 디 녜바 마녜바 디게 티닝 아주 상계비 최시에서도 가와 가서 라고 차지시 데도스 라고 참 파게도스 라고 참 데도스 라고 참 아니 람기 소들 녜바 매바 인디 라만 땡가 조윤디 기비신이 땡가 조윤디야 기비신이 땡단데 간주 마주고 돈 땡데야지 다 단단히 슈브네시 니준 장선 양답에 따오송보 람기 소이면 니신예데 요나 기비신이 땡단 노르단산이 요마다 기비신이 체가 두두양 가리체가 두그래. 빼나 수수 장주기 셈로 dumba 요딩이지. 장주기 셈로 니신이지. 다 디귤이 깨고도 세 dumba 요딩이지 임바이나 장주기 셈 귤이 깨니 기비신이 체가 두고. 디 체가 두윤디 파길 라마 기비신이 디 라마 기비신이 디 민카르체도 마체 규변조 가리 여다메 코르 기루 가리 여메 깨져 요마로. 깨바 포이 모이 깨져 개요 마로. 한 크이 도줄에 장주기 셈도 도민도 쏘 dim믹지 누구마도 셴바겠단 누구 말와 당한주 람기 쏘들 녀바녀 매바 인디 아니 람이기 윤된 따당데 노르조 망고질 믹대제 간다 가서 조민고사디 마통바시 아니 셴바 야라 망고지 통하지 아니 가서 도 된당 마지고 딱가도 슝니 숨는 신기 된당 따다 메디에 가서 망고 용구요다 투스 온디 투디
So the first step, if you will, is to gain certainty that renunciation, bodhicitta and the correct view are the three main aspects of the path. They're like the real essence of the path. So the first certainty or the first step is to gain certainty that this is so. This is the case. That's the first thing. Then if you feel the need arise or you notice that there is a genuine aspiration or desire to generate these three in one's own mind, then at that point very naturally the next step is to find someone who has generated these three and go to them, rely on them, spend time with them, learn from them until the same three things are generated within you. So these are the two steps. The first step is to gain certainty that this is so, and then the second one is to find someone who has these three and then rely on them and spend time, study from them, practice with them until you also generate these three in one's own mind. Where we're stuck, where most people are stuck initially, is that one is not certain that these three are necessary and that they are the real foundation of the path. And when this certainty is not there, then one's identification of what the Dharma is, of how the Dharma should be practiced, becomes kind of situational, or it varies from person to person, from moment to moment, and one doesn't really understand what the real essence is. And as a result of one's identification of the Dharma as different things, then one goes around relying on teachers for different things because they're giving one different things, without really understanding the real reason for why one even has to rely on a guru. Whereas, if one has this kind of certainty, and then one is going to look for someone who can enable that or generate that in one's own mind, then you can't really make an error in judgment. Because then, if for instance you're someone who wants to generate bodhicitta, you're solely concerned with finding somebody who themselves have generated it. And at that point, who they are, how famous they are, whether they are male or female, how rich they are, how many disciples they are. There's no room for this. This is not this is not a concern anymore. Your only concern is finding someone who can give you exactly what you want because you have identified it correctly. Whereas if you don't have this identification, forgetting what the real point is or what the real message is, you kind of stick to all of these secondary peripheral things that might not be immediately important, or that might not even be the real heart of why you're doing it.
Anyone
else?
Mike.
Gena expressed earlier that if we have the motivation to attain, for example, liberation and therefore go to debate ground and so forth, then all of that is influenced by that motivation and is actually becoming a cause for that. My question is for how do I find certainty that this is actually the case? Because when the mind is not active anymore, the thought is not active anymore, we are saying that it's still influenced by the motivation we have done in the morning or we try to generate. I still don't know for how long does that last and what is actually the say of that.
Migyu di tarba la shane digi dundu ta chura droya tang ta di kulong chune chura tang chawa khare la khale juna o digi gyu la tosha gres tus ma kana so ni ngaran la sebo khare mindu shuna ta shoni pe na shoni di shoge di kunilang tende kulong che ne chawa ma tsomi ondu digi tanda ngundu ma gyur na yang nazo nam yu de la tsis be keje chik shigiro age ta tsisimbe tse kawa padu dhugudu mindu ta shoge kulon chuye shana koran tsisimba di tsi khachur padu dangudu mindu ani di chawa tsangma digi gyula drom meki tse ngozin kabu shira dus di kandisi moji chagore
ta kulon digi shuk sayade pena tarbala mi ne di kune taba undu chindogi sambaji kune langje ni gewe lola ju karita sangchonge sangbicho chawa khandi chigine di chedu che segi loi kulong ya u chue che ta di je lo kulong unju wa ke meba ina ya reda kulong unju wa ke meba ina ya di je la lunga gi gewa sangbo den de chue yongdu je yongdu tini sedigi tamnyenda takanda tse dinangi samba yorwa di magi gi padu di shukti yoderta ta di paru dewana jik susugi le sangbo da chawa sangbo do sam yundu paru dewala ko chöge gi lebe sodo tse dinangi sambe lebe sodo tam nyenda gi lebe sodo tende ko samlo di dinala le sona ngami gi shukti nyam diyorta yang goni chyo kurta takanda di shuk koro lungunjuwa meba ina kogi di ngargi chebadigi kulundigi miyu di tema majeba kogi du sindeba chiyo na di ringdela ani tsidi yorta ta di tema di jeso na tsidi yebar.
So the question here is the force of that motivation. How long does that the energy or does that strength of the motivation or that resolve, how long does it last? And even though, like for instance in the morning you generate that strong motivation, once you have generated that motivation, even though you might not actively be thinking that or desiring that and have that motivation, even though you don't have that manifest mental state, whatever physical, mental and verbal actions you do after having generated that state, the limit or the point when they are no longer pushed or they are no longer steered by that motivation is when if the opposite thoughts, like for instance, if you're desiring liberation, if thoughts of fame, reputation, or being well known, or whatever other kind of worldly thoughts, if these thoughts start creeping in and you notice that these thoughts arise in you, then that's an indication that the strength or that resolve that you started out with your motivation in the morning, its strength, its energy has currently ended. If, however, you continue to engage in virtuous action and you see that these thoughts are not creeping up or they do not affect your mind, then the strength of that resolve or that motivation still carries on. So when you say how long is that strength there, it's when you forget that that is your goal and the opposite intention or the opposite concerns creep in or there's space for them to come in, then that resolve is ended. So there you need to re-motivate yourself and regenerate that motivation.
Tas su kulon chodangi kulon choyondu rigpa samlo tangdang da rigpa shuk che ma che da nyeshi khasu shuk che ma chung dindigi kheba gi chidi khagas padu dang ma dang kheba yor kansa khashela kulon shoge choysha na gonda padu ani chuge gi samba da chidinang gi samba ke ma jo ka thonge yor khashela chuju chukbo do ka thonge yor khashela chuju shibo do ka thonge din yor 디인도 아니 수수기 꾸론 남균이 쬐되게 여봐 인도 꾸론디 쬐네 니마직 나로라 쇼게 꾸론디 쬐네 추저 가져 봐도 아니 세드는 삼바마게야 거기 두 소소소 심주 채워 심주 채네 아니 소소라 고 라산 쇼게 꾸론 쬐 추지직니절 세드는 삼라게 고조고도나 슉 단계 요 말에 슉 단계 매바 인도 아니 kulon shuk chero tanya re, en tuzhe diyan tongro tanya che, chuzu nyi nala kulon chuwe dili sogu gore. Ta namgyu nganzo kulon chuwe ki nyamnen di tun chuk su gore ta. Namgyu da le thangbo wala tun chuk su je, ko kanda chuzu shishi tanya keje shi gore ta. Namgyu kulon yagu uji chuwe shaban di chuzu shi bado. Chuzu shi na kogi shuk di ye rugu yoba indu, yang goni tun nyi badi che, tun sumba dilshi na kanda chuzu nyi sabje la tun chuk che je, dusul ngorwa. 다디 강사 소소소 개바 요리 단다 가담비 라마지 딘데 송 요리 단다 라리 추문나라디 공기디 롱디 창랑도 봐 가담비 땅이 첸디 쟁이면도 라마디기 아니 쇼게 다오지글라더니 꿀론디 야고 쥐마토나 지와메다 보소로지 야고 주 고마토나 디 니만 인간게 레가 가리 제샤버디 창마 세드는 상비 상황도 쇼르고도스 오 공기 딘데 송고도스 라네 딘데 지금 송여라 어디서로 봐 소자다디 소소소기 꿀론디 쥐 가져보도 단계도 소소 심주 제제 안 딜럽밥에 안 투제링 동기 나로로 튠 사와 쥐에디 인지미치 채고 그래.
Based on how one then generates one's motivation and how strong one's reflection and reasoning and conviction is, based on all of these factors, every individual has a different duration for how long that kind of motivation maintains its strength or its energy. For some people it can last for an entire day, just by doing it in the morning it can last till the evening. For others it lasts 6 hours, for others it lasts 4, whatever it might be. And so what's important that each one does individually, that we all do, is that we see and we observe how long the strength of our motivation manages to steer our mind in the course of a day. So that can be seen by how our concerns for this life or worldly concerns start creeping and how quickly after we have generated that motivation and started out. And if we see that they are starting to kind of falter or they're loosening their strength, then it's important that at that point one either makes that motivation stronger or reduces the intensity of that generating the motivation and does it repeatedly in the course of a day. So the whole concept of having 6 sessions in a day, which is 24 hours, is based on the assumption that each session lasts about 4 hours in its intensity. And then when the intensity of one session ends, then you do the next one. So dividing a day of 24 hours into 6 sessions is done because the assumption is that each session manages to last for about 4 hours. Then at the end of those 4 hours, since your motivation strength kind of falters and the opposite thoughts creep in, then you do another one. So that's something that's going to vary from individual to individual based on how one generates that motivation and how one's practice is. For instance, in the Lamrim, there is this mention of one Kadampa Lama, I don't remember his name, who says that if one morning I don't reflect on death and impermanence, I see that during the course of that day, my concerns for this life, they start to come creeping in. And so it's extremely important that one checks for oneself how strong one's intention and motivation is and how long it can last, and then finds a way to either strengthen it or regenerate it at different points in the day when it's low, when it's become less strong. Anyone else?
When meditating on the points of renunciation and bodhicitta in order to strengthen motivation, most of it, from when I think about it, most of it is developed towards realizing how many things are suffering, how it aggregates to suffering, and so the renunciation becomes a part of getting away from suffering. Is there a value in trying also to develop an understanding of the goal? Because that the goal seems very difficult for me, like liberation or Buddhahood seems very difficult to try to grasp or understand, except as just a negation of suffering.
당가주 꿀론 계단시도와 소저 꿀론 계단다고 림바 마소나 공아주 심규를 꿀론 림바 용단다고 당보디 풍불 하마메비 고고들 다간다 풍부디 동에게랑 신도 통 다티 예베 링들라 대우 매바지기 인디 티 매바지 남충나 세계 삼로든지 코용도 다 디체도 가르치고도 또 딜미네 다 디든 저거요 가르치고도는 디체요 라비용도 상마 딜미제 그 용기요바 손자 먼저 꿀론 당보디 풍불 하마메비 고고들다 풍불 하마메비 고고디 다딩 가졸 꿀론 당보 소라든 가졸 디께 고고요다 다 디께 용도 아니 대단냠도 탐지심이 고방라 미예디 신이다 삼로 쉬우 땅고 그렇다 탐지심이 고방 스케줄 시행도 응어나 소소 심이 탐지심이 고방디 소소로 고담고 고고요나 가리치도 고고요 랑기톤도 고고요로 왜 셴기톤도 고고요로 왜안 탐지심이 고방 코랑기 캐주 가리 이메 다 탐지심이 고방 세디 단기 라와나시 풍부 동에 때이지 풍부매비 고과 라와나시 탐지심이 고방들 딜라야면도 와 탐지심이 고방스 라비인데 아니 캠바 타르침바 제와 타르침바 뉴바 타르치바 덴디게지 시용도 디 덴디치가 고고도세 깨져들래 용도 당보고로 집어들립기로 봐 랑기톤도 고고도 왜 셴기톤도 고고도 가리기톤달로 고고요 당보 지기대 다 캠바 타르침바 메나 강에 가르도 세와 타르침바 메바이나 강에 가르도 뉴바 타르침바지 메바이나 소소로 강에 가르도 나라 강에 개민도 미셴발로 로바시엘 강에지도 마도 나라 강에 개민도 삼바지 여바이나 대가라는 게 있더니 심진을 미비 인지글로 종해야 돼 땅원도 땅나마도 탑시심바 강에요 뭐 어디인데 상기 주고바 미유스메라 아니 응연라 상기 주고비 상기 주고방기 계제된 사상지 아니 심지엔된 졸라 심지엔된 졸 가딩 첨부인 로종해지다 상기 코랑기 정줍세기 된다 코랑기 코와든 조 차례에 대해서 상만 망부지라고 되고 그랬다. 삼로 땅고지고 그래. 다 냥딜 미게데 가졸 레라보요. 당길라와나시 풍부디 동에기 짜와 임바디 라지 트여서나 아니 풍부 매바지 구구도 라바 타가랑기 고발을 미터. 고발을 미터. 다 풍부 매바 소에 두민도 아니 소에 여담에 대주 잡아체 쇼고레데 칸달 풍부 매바지 코 동에 되게 매바 인도 가나 풍부 매바지 코 랑신기 풍부 동에 자와 임바 인도 풍부 매바데 랑신기 코 사모코도 그러고 what the direction.
So when you're generating your motivation of what you want to do, the first step is that you recognize the aggregates are the nature of suffering, and the first motivation or the first intention that you have is simply to want to not have those aggregates. That's it. That is the first step that you have to generate. So if you recognize that the aggregates are the nature of suffering, naturally you want a state without those aggregates. That's just natural. And that is the first level of intention or motivation that one has to develop on this. In a second moment, if you then decide that you want to attain Buddhahood, then there's a lot more that's involved. Because when you're talking about Buddhahood, you're not just talking about the absence of aggregates. So the qualities that characterize Buddhahood are omniscience, complete love, complete potential. And so there's a lot more involved in envisioning and understanding what Buddhahood is. But if you want to desire or you aspire for that, there's a set of things that you need to figure out before, which is, do you need this or not? If you do need it and you want it, do you desire it for yourself or for others? If you do desire it for yourself or for others, then what are the qualities that it has that can give you this? Because if that is not your wish and you don't desire that, or you have a thought that says, why do I need those qualities? Sure, it's great if there's omniscience and there's this incredible state of love, but I'm happy with what I've got. I'm happy with the absence of aggregates of the nature of suffering. In that very instant when that thought arises, which is, well, that's a great state for other people, but I don't need it for myself, you've already cut off the possibility of generating kindness or love towards other sentient beings. And so, at that point, to have a good idea or a complete understanding of the qualities that qualify the Buddha, you also have to go through the entire stage of understanding how important sentient beings are to you, to remove all of the obstacles to generating that wish to attain that state for Buddhahood. That's the second motivation and intention. And to understand that, you have to understand all the qualities that are there, and you have to see whether it's relevant to you, if you want it, why you want it, what does it do for you. Until all of those things are clear, then that becomes kind of, it's not relevant. Whereas when you talk about liberation, that's very easy to understand. Because if you've understood that the aggregates are the base of suffering, then liberation is the removal of the aggregates. At that point, what you could try, if you want to analyze, there is room for still discussing whether such liberation is possible or not. But in and of itself, the desire to not want those aggregates is the wish to attain liberation.
Anyone
else? Sorry. In continuity of this process of motivation and meditations, if people are going through Alzheimer's, dementia, and their intentions dies as they age or forget, so what happens to their mind in continuity when they have to take rebirth? What happens?
When they have to take rebirth?
If they have to make a choice.
The kulonchu the same natsu or temper jedro Alzheimer's. The dende natsa pova ina and you conzo kewa jemala comitaji chagina. Kajina kulon kishuk the manyam duroga.
Nyamdu.
Temper jedro, chuna, any conzo soso, nyamlin che de yoda, nyamsulan de yodo. 교지만 하게도 자기가
또 겨지만 딘데도 차루스 그 라이스게면도 이네 경우라 그러다 경슈라 그러다 딘데 나자지 나바이네 경슈라 그러다 또 세딜 경슈라 그러와 지갈라 먹고 논주에 되는 사마 가도 그러와 제도고 말와 또 세디단 세치만이 카도 무중어제 서로 심바인데 디기 슈겐디 치말라이 용거다 강이 경춘부라 그러다 간다.
So what exactly will happen next life? I can't really say, but it is a big loss in this life, because not having that ability or that recollection anymore, then since this life and the next life are kind of direct cause and direct effect, what happens towards the end of this life then is also going to spill over to some degree in the next one. And so if someone is undergoing that, then it is definitely a big loss in this one and then resultantly in the next one also.
Tadingi kiranzol di loju shubenata ni gyanla ji yores kong shagalamode da nyungshi di tanda poa cancer dire da sok sana shubuji yobayindi ane amji zogi kapchikdo wa di kapdi mingchik sege dungi hago maso di kapdi gyabayna ane mi tempa tome soyeshekdo wa suzu da tsowa dungi tsowa tagudi ku nyongtu marwa ane mi tomdom soyeshekdo warwa suzu da di kapdi gyabgores kajina sok sana shubuji yorwa ti gyabgores di gengi di gyagi menserda 다 가질네 시에게 참을 리기 요바인데 그리고 dim구고 요래 고 세강장 미세 강고 쉐를 미난 종제 깔리 잡지 되어 다시 가라면 그리고 dim구고 요디 디디 그리고 dim에서로 타마토메 샤반 경슈라고 하러 갑자로 지어 어디로 왔다.
So I'll give you I'll narrate an episode. One of my teachers, he had stomach cancer, and at the time of his death, there was a lot of pain from the tumor, and so the doctors told him that there was some injection. I don't remember what the medicine was, but that injection would also make you kind of muddled and fuzzy in the mind. It would make your brain kind of foggy. And so the doctors were telling Gen, to my teacher, to get this injection. But because he was nearing death, and at that moment of death you have to really focus and you really have to kind of complete your practice, and he had spent his whole life working to that. When the doctors told him you need to get this injection, he said, I don't want it, because even though there was pain, he wanted to ensure that he wouldn't get slightly clouded and fuzzy, and that he could really focus and concentrate his mind, because otherwise it would have been a real loss for him. So it is extremely unfortunate if someone does get that state.
From the point of view of the Buddha himself, does the Buddha perceive himself as a person?
Person?
Yeah, Kangsang. Does like from the perspective of the Buddha, not from our perspective, we say Sangye Chomnande is a person, but then from the perspective actually of the Buddhas themselves, do they see themselves as person?
Kela Sangye Rangi Singor la Sangye Rangi la Khansa Chigi Dushe Shagi Yonamena. Sangye Singor la Sangye Rangi Sangye Khansa du Nangere Nangamares. Shengi Thongor la Nangor la Sangye Khansa ki Nambaji Nangero. The Sangye Rangi Singor la Khansa Nangere.
당아주 디 지다 랑랑 셴나세 계지지여 상계 랑랑라 가리여레세 지다 야 셴낭 균이 계제 셰지니 여러와 당아주 강사 셴기 상계라 강사도 나데지 여비나 디 강사디 나오나시 강사 ngobi니술레 임베이나 안 상계 고랑기 남고로와 이는 낭예데 랑랑 말이 셴낭레스 가주 남지 계제 셰레지 여러다 기대하고로 어디 계지지 여러와 So
there is a discussion about the Buddha's perception and how the Buddha perceives things directly or through the perception of others. And so in that discussion, if it is something that exists, that is perceived by others, it has to be perceived by the Buddha as well. So if the Buddha is perceived as a person by someone else, and that person that they perceive exists, then the Buddha also has to perceive it. But this perception is via the perception of others, it's not direct.
Tayan doji jube nanglola sangye gi songjing doji jube nanglo sangye gi songden ri yor sangye namni chuni de demba namni chuju kus chik song yorwa kangda ngala sosu tons kangda ngala darsheba teda ani tishin sheme tons kangda dindi songji yor ta digi songdigi kowa gyabdan de la keba susu dishi gyabdan mindawa chigi yor da ini keba rikchigi dishi gyabdan de la sangye sedi ani chugi ing dishi ni ani tela lar dawa mebe chugi nyambar shadebi gi ishi chujuku di sangye res sangye ngoma di teres da sangye ngoma sen da sangye sedi teres da ta duja susu gi sonam gi tso 아니 디신시하고 디 코랑 나르기 두기 면함 다 창마 여대로와 나 로발람이 내가서 셈게다 면함도 찾아 코랑을 창디여와 이내 코랑이 어디 춘일라 다음에 무슨 냠버샤도 이시 주고 다 두자 코랑기 소남기 초 아니 두자 코랑기 면함 아니 손데 덴데기 겜베 아니 수주고 담이나 취기 인텔레 수주고 담이지 두자 코랑기 랑랑시지 샤데바시 마도 상기 코랑기 랑랑 미바치 디시디지여다.
In the Diamond Kata, the Vajrachedaka, the Buddha says the Buddha is dharmata, which is another way of talking about emptiness. It is the nature of things. And the nature of phenomena is Buddha. And then the Buddha goes on to say, whoever sees the Buddha to be form, whoever says that they see the Buddha because they see form, whoever says they hear the Buddha because they hear his words, does not know the Buddha, does not see the Buddha. And so this one statement that the Buddha makes in the Vajrachedaka Sutra, when it's explained by various different scholars or different masters, there's different explanations, out of which one explanation is that what the Buddha is the Buddha is a mind or a consciousness, sort of an exalted consciousness that is resting in uninterrupted equipoise on the nature of phenomena. Uninterrupted in the sense that he never gets out of it, or a Buddha never gets out of it. So it is a state where the nature of phenomena and the mind that rests on that nature is inseparable. That is the Buddha. Now from this state, or from this sphere of reality, or this sphere of emptiness, based on the merits of the disciples and sentient beings, and the aspirations and prayers of the Buddha before they attained Buddhahood that they generated during the path, when these two things combine, from this state or this sphere which is Buddhahood, or this is the Buddha, then based on each individual's merit and each individual's capacity, this state manifests as the form body or different aspects, different form bodies. But what is actually the Buddha, the way it's described it is this union of the nature of phenomena and the mind that rests uninterruptedly in it.
Tabena nganzu sodaw nganzu suyimbe na chik tishin sheba chogi tubiku dos sharela diba di legi diba di zo yimba indi nganzu dos legi diba di dos ma se legi diba di seba da nyamdo an tishin sheba chogi tubiku dai chogi tubiku jendyo da tele chungusus nyendyo dinde kulong samba da ani sondeb da dinde chamjur kodada dus lamdung chungba yina ani tanda chegi yingla nyambar shada bi shishu ku tele chogu du keran duna pe sharing go resta odal lama kebaji dishi dus kyong gorda.
So this master then says, what is preventing us from perceiving this form body of the Buddha is our karmic obscurations. That's the obstacle that's kind of preventing it. So when you remove these karmic obscurations and the wish to perceive the form body of the Buddha and the wish to receive teachings and practice the teachings of the form body, when these increase, when these conditions come together, this master says, from this state or from this sphere of reality, from this sphere of the nature of phenomena, then the form body of the Buddha will just manifest then and there in that very moment when these two things come together.
So, what exactly are the causes for us not to be separated from our spiritual guide until we achieve the enlightenment, and how exactly the connection works in the next life?
다디레 아주 지단기 수남기 소치사기도 와 수남기 소강 사샤바디 투몽기 규리 투몽기 규 다디니 딘디기 수남기 소 투몽기 규 인디킹이 수남기 소디 디부 카리미 마미세디 아주 면함기 카규르고시 면함기 바카규르고요 땅 장바고미야 장주기 셈고미야 동니고미야 간다 예외자와 파르진 투비스에다 가다 소소 예외자와 카레 사기에나 사샤버리 투문기 예외자와 체 예외자와 소남기 소 이시기 소 카레 여번지 여러봐 디고 규디체 따디 치마라 예외신인의 체야 예외신의 양타바의 체야 안디 예신도 제수 송야 아니 도시지 용해디 디 귤을 도야디 아주 가르치고 그러스나 면함기 카규르고 그러다 면함기 카규르기요 디 인딩 아주 양의 양도 다 면함 경고 그러다 면함 잡고 그러다 또디 아주 상만을 찍버려 빼나가라서 짐바지 땅샤바에 나다 단다 짐바지 땅샤바에 있는 디 디부 치마로 롱주 용구르다 다 롱주 디 아니 최체야라 펜 토다 마토스 라바이나 거 예수 예바케요 말이 다 제만 최체비 튠진라 송야라 디 기베자와디 멀럼기 카규르고르다 소즈 디인데 제롬비지 라니 주문 송야들에 주림 나버다 봐 시송 짐발로 소바 troche 아니 멀럼 디마미베 삼자스 소즈 멀럼기 삼줄 제고 그래서 멀럼기 So
merit, when we talk about the collection of merit, that itself is it's a common cause. So whatever merit one might accumulate, whether it's compassion, kindness, generosity, the perfections, that storehouse of merit is just a common cause. Then what kind of result will mature or arise from this merit is directed or determined by the kind of aspiration or the prayers that one makes. So the aspiration may be the better word. What aspirations one makes. And so whether in the next life one is going to come in contact with a teacher or a guru or the dharma or whatever, with that common storehouse of merit, then it is an aspiration that one makes that is going to direct that merit in one direction or another. And for that reason, one has to repeatedly make aspirations and supplications. For example, if one engages in generosity, the result of that generosity will be that one will have riches. Riches in the sense one will have things that one enjoys. But the fact that one will have the experience of enjoying things as a result of generosity, whether that experience of abundance is then something that is favorable for one's practicing of the Dharma or not, is not guaranteed simply by having engaged in generosity. It is generosity coupled with the aspiration of being able to use that abundance in the practice or to facilitate one's practice of Dharma. And so that's why Lama Tsongkhapa in his Lamrim Chemo, he says, for you to have an effect arise, you have to generate the motivation, engage in the action, and then again and again you have to make aspirations and supplications.
다 단다 면함기 주 삼줄 셰체 규직 그 규진직 동스테시 교거다 다 규진 샹바직의 카리슬라베이나 아주 신이 된주 로장연도 디나로라 아주 자베 로 당보 종에디 라마 상계수 따야 들어 라마 기비신이 상계수 따 믹대제 로 종에 들어봐 니버디 아니 가진 제수 챙에 들어봐 자와 대바 창했지 되니 가진 제수 챙했지 되니 숨바텔라 아니 가진 주비 최변이 해야 돼 아주 진이도 주다 조 로종에 숨 뒤로 가다 다 치말라 기위신이 제수 송얘기 규견 줘야디 연내면에 찍디 가리라나 가진 주비 최변이 해야 돼 가진 주비 최변이 해야 돼 봐. 다 기위신이 내가 가르쳤나 로마디 고 추로 고에 들어가다 추로 고에 들어가 소소다 추로 고에 그런 게 미소어디 임바 인디 로마디기 라마디기 미유도 튠바 체제 고 다다 고로 로초선로야 추람도 소야지 중보이나 달라마딜란 주비 쳐박이 예tor다 다디 쳐바 탐지기 나네다 초도 규비 쳐바 세고르다 아주 남기 형은 남 쳐바 탐지 용반데 라마 쳐바 양다 삼슬라로 봐 아주 납기 요르바 다디 쳐바 대야 고 상승이 쳐바데 딘디게지 시고 말로 소 가진 주비 최변이에 들어 디 제바이나 디기 치말라 양 기회신이 양다고 트에기 고 유진 초도 규버지 디시에기 요르다 달라말로 주비 최변이야 봐 정보이나 저rum부식이 라리 정보 나라에 송요르디 지당기 상계 탐지 투충이 인수 로직 바세 깨지지 요르다 디디시 고스 딩사부로 주요 dimmogoche ina yang kandar sangi chigli chöba ina sangi 탐지에 넣고 chö드야지 냠바니 기고는 chö드야 딘디게지 지기요 ina yang 라마들 chö소나 아니 상기 탐지를 chöba 디기 냠도다 고쳐줘야지 다연 디디시데 고 딩사부 주요다 디디시데 먹어서 간다 딘디지 숨고요다 다디 최디 조 상승기 쳐봐도 세게요 말 주베 쳐봐도 세고다 디 제바이나 아니 겨와 탐지 듣고 투예 라마 쳐봐 디기 라마 투예바 디기 겨와 탐지 투예 줘야지 냠도 랑신기 디기 소나무 소 빠면 사대야지 디 슈긴 디기 치말라 고기 비신이 다다 체디야 어디 규진직 시에고 양아도 슝기 나로나
So the first cause is the aspiration or the supplications that one makes. The second cause is relying on a spiritual teacher. And of the various practices that one engages in relying on a spiritual teacher, there's seeing one's guru as the Buddha. The other one is recollecting their kindness. And then there is doing what they have told or doing as they have advised. So like following or practicing their teachings, that's the third one. And so of the second, when we're talking about the second cause of ensuring that one comes back in contact with one's spiritual guide, then of these three, it's the third one, which is practicing or the offering of one's practice. And the reason for that is that the main purpose or the main purpose of the existence of a guru or a teacher is to bring one on the path of the Dharma. And so if that's their job, and then we practice what they say and we can actualize what their instructions are, then that we call it as the offering of one's practice. That is the highest form of offering. It's considered the highest form of offering because that's what they're there for. And so in doing that, we ensure that we will be again have the opportunity to be with them again. So there are these two explanations. Both of them are they're actually very deep and profound, and so we don't need to get into the explanations. But we do say, it is said in the teachings that all the Buddhas are of the same taste or if they're of the same nature. So when you make offerings to the one Buddha, it amounts to making two offerings of all the Buddhas. And the fact that all the Buddhas are of the same nature requires a little bit more detail, which we don't get in now. Similarly, it also says that when you make offerings to your guru or to one guru, it amounts to making offerings to all the Buddhas. And this also has a slightly deeper meaning, which we won't get into now. But what happens is when you make offerings of one's own practice to the guru, then you are pleasing the guru and you're pleasing all the Buddhas simultaneously. So this is considered another very important cause for ensuring that you will come in contact with the guru. And Lama Tsongkhapa also says this in the Lamrim.
다 치마라 기회신에다 트비 규칙 가르쳐서나 라마 뢰다이들 기회신이 땡세 안 기회신이 뢰당 바이나 디 치마라 기회신에다 카트비 규세 거다 뢰당에기 규진 잡으디 뢰당에기 규진 잡으디 가주 니여 찍디 라마를 교통을 뢰당에 찍디 라메 가딩 제는 뢰당에 니 용거여 봐인데 아니 라마를 교통을 뢰당게요 라마 뢰당게요 손자 아니 디기 차들라 라마 상계수 따야기 연된 종야기 미거디 송래 가딩 제바 디기 뢰당에 지 용거여 봐 손자 디기 차들라 아니 가딩 제수진 그밖에 송거여 다 된다도도 당봉을 라마디 땐다마디 딱진나 아니 땐 세비제라 딱 한들 라마들 수수 셈 딩니 뢰당 주메다 디 뢰당 바이나 디 치마를 기회신인데 집이 규인 시버 디 뢰마당 바체제 뢰마당 바이나 디기 치마라 라마디기 제수 송에 귤 두고 요래 시버 로지 슈베너다 좀딘 디기 단다 깨럽지긴 나올라 아니 디디송여 오 디레 갈사 좀된데다 간다 사자 가와이는 게 되게면도 야가게다 간다 사지치기 나올라 간다 강이지 체제 단다디 가르래 샤지기 리그포라 세기요 야보데 금밍하고 돼 정면도 소다 간다 야부지기도 샤지 미상 도시제 세기 로지지여 심지 세들이 제베 카돌라 아니 좀된데 그런 운용지 쇼세 또 운용을 수요라고 땡지 간다 도 쇼세 아니 디디 군가오 리베 땅이 로기 스테레 담로시스 딱 한다 세울라이드 디레 간다 니주지 하버다 니주지 하제 좀된디기 콜라 여드비 게롱망보지 좀된디 뢰당지 dor다 또 군가오디 좀된디 뢰당지 두고요 말 좀된디 냐도 쇼디기 거다 아니 디던 제네 좀된디기 깨르비 로지 송세 아니 군가오 탄다 깨와 디지고 말레스 깨와 셴도레 디든지 여레스 세자 아니 좀된디기 코란 장강바기 깨와 강비 깨부든지 깨와시 아니 대단냠도 강비 코르망부 여버시 아니 깨부든지 강바도 니 심시 지지도 강바 셴바상마 트회 땅 강비 깨부디 심용도 강바 셴바상마 트회도 디디 강바직 안 디콜라 대제 마트여버시지 뢰마당어치 두스데딩 어디 군가우들이 코냐마인들이 셰버스 단다인디 디슬레제 간다 딘디기 체제 아니 좀된디 군가우 제수 송대야지 간다 좀 군가우 코랑이 좀된디 뢰마당에 깨와 디지구마이 뭐 깨와 망벌도 뢰마당마시 두스 여대버티 어디 규진직 시에고르다 남규관조 장고
So when we talk about then the third cause, which is essential to ensure that one is not separated from one's spiritual guide, is that to explain it from the opposite side of what becomes a cause for for being separated from one's teacher or for one's guru, is if we reject them in this life or we abandon them. And the two reasons why one abandons or one kind of rejects one's guru is because either one sees fault with them or one forgets their kindness towards oneself. And so as a remedy to not seeing faults with the guru, it speaks of having to see or practice to see the guru as the Buddha. And it's as a remedy to not seeing faults in one's guru. And as a remedy to forgetting their kindness, it is that one generates or practices recollecting again and again their kindness towards oneself. And the reason one does this is because these two are then reasons for abandoning or rejecting one's guru in this life, which is considered a cause for being separated. And so to ensure that one is not separated, one practices the antidote to these two things. And so, like it said, first one checks carefully who one wants to consider or rely on as one's guru. And then once you have relied on them, then deep down inside you never reject them or you never kind of get rid of them as one's guru. And the Buddha, I think in the Jataka tales, he speaks of a situation where, I don't remember exactly how the description was, but there was a time when there was a king who was killing a lot of people from the Shakya clan. And at that time there was many monks who were following the Buddha, but when the situation became difficult, then all of them abandoned the Buddha except Ananda. And Ananda remained with the Buddha in that life. And then the Buddha narrates another life where the Buddha was the king of swans. And while the Buddha was the king of swans, he had a lot of swans that were around him. Amongst them there was also Ananda. And then when, I think it was a hunter who came and took this king, all the swans flew away, but Ananda also remained there. So the Buddha is narrating in this story how the fact that the Buddha has not abandoned, the Ananda and the Buddha have this connection, and the Buddha continues to keep Ananda or guide Ananda. It's not just limited to how Ananda was in this life, but how over many lives and many hardships, Ananda has consistently never abandoned the Buddha and never rejected the Buddha. And so this is another important cause of how it will ensure that you are not separated from a spiritual guide. Anyone else?
I still have doubt about how we can generate renunciation from having realized all three types of sufferings, particularly the third type of suffering, without having a really good understanding of emptiness. So I wonder how we can actually generate a proper sense of renunciation without having at least a very good conceptual understanding of emptiness.
Dembashigi Gogdengi Nambashidis Mason Yondu Gogwa Shiwa Kyanum Yijons. Ane Lamden Mason Yondu Lam Rigba Druba Nijins. Sonza Nijons Lab Yondu Gogwa Mi was Corta. Koala Yijong Gogwa Mi Nirta. Koala Yijong would win the draw. Koala Yijong would win the draw. Dijela Gobato Gobaton, Tini Gogwala Mi, and Titunugu, Joma Maibo Lodella, Nijons Lab Chimberwa. O di indu Gobomatona Gogwala Mi to Mare. The Gogwala Migbala Tunigi Zawa Pumbudici Pumbugi Guzo della. 아니 세롱 임바지 셰구고 여바 인디 당진 신질로도 통고로 디 인디 담에기 고가지 로라 마샤바이나 아니 고고 통통 말해 디윤디 니중기 삼바 친이상 줄게발라 또 동반이세나리 담에세나 디코와디 구그레스 또 딘디 뒤주 뒤행기 캐바 릭치기요 땅 나랑 단다 디초로 조디기요다 디 구그레스 삼바 디초로 조디기요다.
So when you say renunciation of the four truths, I don't know the English translation for these 16 aspects, but when you're talking about the truth of cessation and the truth of the path, each one of them has these four aspects, which I don't remember how they translate. Does anyone know? For definitive emergence? Okay, anyways, of these four, there's these 8, right, when you're talking about the cessation and the path. And the fourth one of the path is that which will definitely release, or like you said, definitive emergence. So when you're talking about renunciation, actually in English also, it's not really translating what in Tibetan is ngechung, because the Tibetan word for renunciation is itself definitive emergence. And so the mind of renunciation itself has to be a mind that, motivated by the wish to be freed from suffering, is now focused on or desires, wishes to attain liberation or cessation. And so since renunciation as a mind is preceded by the wish to be suffering, but in that moment itself it is aiming or focused or engaging in cessation without a good understanding of what cessation is, it's unlikely or almost impossible to aspire to attain it or even focus on it. And so there is one set of masters who say that if you want to have renunciation, you have to have realized emptiness, or you can call it selflessness, call it however you want. And I find myself kind of following suit with this thought that if you have renunciation, you have to have generated an understanding of emptiness.
So 이중다 이중화 세디다 녀버 중화 세니 투주미다. 이중화 세디 간조 단단 간조 풍부 코로발라 셴바 말로바 세지 코로발로 로 추원 조데라 로디 코로비 추고스마 슈그니 조데가 오로바 다 텔레술로 이중화 세디 로 동비케저로 간조 코로발로 로 도스 코로발 셴바 도비케저로 so 코로발로 셴바 도세디 코로바디 가지고 풍부디임바 디인데 가지고 셴바 로에디 풍부들 로고고 그렇다 풍부들 셴바 로고로 수소 풍부라 풍부리 이중수 풍부를 셴바로 디인데 아니 풍부메베 고과 다 토브롱이메디 때 토브롱이메디 시용도 아니 풍부메베 고과 될라 미제 튼dunye베 삼바텔라 딱 예중수 소저 이중다 예중 고카가도 봐.
So here I think this might be This is like I think there's a bit of a translation error in English. Not so much translation, it's become standard, we call it translated as renunciation. But one should not mistake these two things. What we in English translate as being disillusioned with samsara, and then what we call renunciation. So renunciation is actually maybe not a right translation. Disillusionment might be okay. Renunciation should be definitive, what is it? Emergence, that's how it's more accurately translated, definitive emergence. So when you're talking about being disillusioned with samsara, the samsara is the aggregates. So you realize that the aggregates, which are the nature of samsara and suffering, are of no benefit. And so you have disillusionment from them, which means you want to be done with them, or you want to go away from them. But from that state, this itself is not renunciation. So one should not mistake renunciation, or now we're calling it definitive emergence, with disillusionment. Disillusionment is the wish not to have these aggregates anymore. Whereas then when we see whether it is possible to get rid of or be freed from these aggregates, and we realize that it is possible to be liberated or to attain a cessation of these aggregates, which is then definitive emergence, and we desire that, that is what is being translated as renunciation. So one is a mind that wants to be done with or be rid of the aggregates by being disillusioned by them, and the other one is that is aspiring to a state that is free from the aggregates. So the two separate states, one should not confuse these two.
Just wanted to follow up on the guru, spiritual friend. What about for those who have created negativities in relationship to our gurus? What advice would you give?
The susu tsawe lama tang susu lama nyamdu tendre pe shik tsaye chi yorwage tendre nyam doye ti o tendre mi de la kya lapcha chi kare yores
tende nyam nengen de la ta di korangi miyu sunda takda meba digirta penata susu
kharche urgela tendre mi di kharche ures ke
midi kharche urse midi kharche ursla na
ta tendre susu tsawe lama nyamdu tendre nyam de ningi mi chi yorwa loma chi
tensu lo ding loma
tensu lo de loma de la lapcha kare yores ta
labja se gorwa
kharche ure mi tendre
dewa ya soye derwa ta kola re soza ta tango tanda dewa nyamdang chidwa tingi deshe shio dewa nyamdang ki kendi karilana loma digi tanda ngazo kulung kedangdi tangbo koroni loma di chulo pa samlo dunye chene lama ten doye jorwa ten dangdi di takda chi konda yagu me deba chide ta nge di tong de gorda ta tangi shubanan shin re tangbo tos töba che tangbo koroni lama ten goya ke merwa tangbo tos töba che ne dini töba di cheba digi kandar tangi lawa nashin kari guguyo ta susola lama di tenga dudugala kari guguyo kari migchi duguyo ta migye di tangi shuba nashin nyejung chansa yangtabi tawa say dendegi samlo dendegi migche ta yamena dingi chogi ngeshe nyeba rapena sangebi chogi ngeshe nyeba chi nga gugudo an ta di lama dil temba yina ngeshe nyeba chi sotu sare se samlo dendegi tohane ko dugu yoba yina ta suzuki miyu di tempo shojirwa miyu di tsangma yindu teta deni lama di tenga dukorwa teta deni lama di tenga dudu suzu miyu da kari dewa yoba di maado shenpa dila te samgi ngazo di merita halama sona da suzu dichi shenpa kyunda yoden dezo la suzuki mikchi droyo marwa ta suzuki ming dosa soba di kari lana suzuki miyu ji sung 아니 디 미유 태단 대화지 파괴를 통제 텔라 미니 두고요 디 미유 두고요나 니 셴바 라메 코랑 용거네다 견 쇼바 소라고도 셴바 가리 중바 있나야 수수기 미유 디다 딱 강에 개면도 봐 대화 딱다 로디기도 봐그 대화 딱다 로디기로 봐 수술 강 구구 요바디 파괴되네 딱다지 코 용디기 요로다 손전 딱 개대 lama de la susu gi lama de ten soso lo goye de pena tungni gi damga so ro che lama de ten je lama de sa ne tungni gi damga te sa ma thwe ba da lo chimba ji ma shung ba ina da lama shamba che ji du go di ko ro da ro ba di lama de le dans ke je ke ma ro ba di lama de le dans ke je ke ma re 디니 고 띵주 로고스 깨제 대한 말에 딘디 라고초나 아니 저지 라마셀링 뭐 땡가도 라마 딩의 코란 찬주 심정 담바슈스 라마든서 신경든지 로르스 라고로 디마르와 디마레 다 단다디 소소 고에디 찬주기 셈 그거요래 딸 라마 디잖아 찬주 셈 쪽이 담바 딱다 라게 요베이나 아니 셴바 견다 셴바 견딘 세 깨제 셴바든서 그 여배 있나야 가다 지 소소다 ngoben을 여드면 지 타시 가고로 줘래 걔데 여배 원도 따나야 디 소소라 never came to. So never came into. But the end, Tamomi is one of the kitchen boys.
So I think how I see it is that maybe it's first important to consider why one relied or how one ended up relying on a teacher. And so when you start, the suggestion is that you listen to the teachings as much as you can. And there isn't any need to rely on someone straight away. First you listen to what they say. And then it's important to kind of know what you want from that person. And say, for example, if you want these three, you want to generate renunciation, bodhicitta, and the wisdom of emptiness, then you check and see whether the person can give that to you. Or if you want to generate the certainty that these are important, then you look for someone who you feel or who can generate that in you. If that's the kind of intention that you've gone in with, then the other things that might happen or the other features or qualities or things that they do don't really concern you. And so, if something were to go wrong, but you are getting what you want, which is this thing over here, then there isn't really any room for error. When you're talking about it being where there is like a fault, or where there is something goes wrong, that something going wrong is not where you have relied on someone for something and they were inadequate or maybe they was insufficient and then you've gone to someone else or you moved over to someone else. That's just natural, that's how things are. If that were the case and if it were merely not carrying on with the same person, which means abandoning or rejecting one's guru or having broken one's connection with them, then Atisha in his search for finding other teachers to teach bodhicitta, that would have also been a break of samaya, for instance. But that's not what it means. So if you know what you want and you're getting what you want, then whatever other things there might be or what other things you might see in that person, they're irrelevant, they're insignificant to you because you've gone there with a very specific purpose. However, so for instance with Atisha's thing, when he wanted to attain or he wanted to generate bodhicitta, he went there with that aim. Assuming the other person has faults, because then whether they have faults or not is also not something you can immediately decide. But even assuming that his guru were to have faults, if he went there with the expressed intention or desire to generate bodhicitta and he was getting that, even if allowing for the possibility that there were other faults or shortcomings in the teacher, they were not related to what he was there for what one was there for. So I feel that the reason why these problems occur often is because the reason why we rely on someone or the motivation with which we consider someone our guru, that seems to be extremely important to consider before one goes about relying on them. That seems to be an essential point.
Jibu Kari Dugu, Jibu Kari Tundinigu, Lama di Tenga doing the Jibu Kari Tundini Dugu. Di Jibu did Lama di Parula, Lama di Tembayina, Suzo Goeg, Jibu Lama dis and Tribute Dumi, di Tango Taji Chedrua, Taji Shevaka Dirua. That Lama del Tenche, Narano Goe, Jibu di Susu Tundini di, that Dinini Raya, Taju Raya, Resha, say, Semling Yavanya Chonja, and Tembayina. That tembayinarda. That dijala lama du kunju zub the mazub kandiji yoba yina kandar susu sötu was korta. Kajilana soso du goedi dinira korta. Rosa dima du merda. Ti indita lama du kunju da kandar ta lama du kunju zubu shoshto ngadi tengi menslan roba yina kandar susu gi jibu di kang tundunye de jibu di Lama Dizani, the Raya do say, Dilla Dibula to Nichung do Sojua. Yamena Daya, that D member Shambaji Kunji Dili Yaga Yungichi, Dibut Tanga do Islamia, called Dibudia, Shambaji Sen Rode or Sigurwa. Can the Dibudi Dinin Raguyuna, go Gudi Tata Ruguyuna, that thing go, that can't you over.
Whereas if you started off and you're clear with what you want and you can identify completely accurately that this person does have that and I can get it from this person because that's what you want and you're sure that that's what you want and then you're sure that that person can give it to you, then at that point if you rely on them, then from that moment onwards, whether they have good behavior, bad behavior, unpleasant behavior, that's your responsibility to ensure that you can change your perception of how they are. Because if you don't do that, then because of their behavior or their conduct, if you decide that you want to go and rely on someone else, it's almost like you're diminishing the importance of why you're there or the thing that you're there for. And then you'll start to look for someone whose conduct or who behaves in ways that are more pleasing. But if earlier you were certain that this is why you're there, this is what you want, and you're getting it from that person, because that's your intention and that's the reason why you find yourself there, then when behaviors or certain problems arise, it's your responsibility to try and ensure that you can change the way you perceive it, because you're there for an express purpose and you are getting it from that person.
다디 지구들로 동해 체마체들이시다. 지구들 동해 첨보여나 가지고 미치가 배는 직된날 대가랑 로방 가지고 직된날로 체 내가 체유도 소속이 된다 개첨보지 두고야지 여번이나 다디 두벌 미딜 캡처나 마도 미딜 로봇세나 마도 샴바 타민두 삼바여나 다 미디기 통중시나래 미디기까지 땅나래 가지는 가지고 세두고도 봐. 가지는 소소 된다디 줍고 거래 다디 콜라 맞은 줍두고 매바이디 가지고 빨리 가지고 잡기도 직된날 대가랑 체되고 거라. 다디 지고지선 남았지.
So this is kind of, it directly depends on how concerned or how desirous you are, how much you want it. And this question of how much you want it and how much you can endure or how much you're willing to not be fazed by things that might not be pleasant is also generally how the world works. If you really want something and the only way you're going to get it normally in the world is if you have someone or you rely on someone and they're the only option for you to get what you really want, whether they treat you badly, they speak badly to you, they misbehave. We do it normally. You do see that people, you always suck up to them and you're polite to them and you feign behavior with them because you know that what you want is going to be achieved through that person. So it really seems to boil down to how much you really want something.
개와망부 된지 그거라 좀 된디 개와지기라 로유 된지 송하고 봐. 수위는 참마 체디낭이 깨져냐 셰디고로 또 체디낭 깨져냐. 좀 된디 체디기 배 코르와서 소로보다 딜레테스 이수인제. 딜레 타레서라고 딜레 트레서라고 된디기 담아지다고 퇴국으로 된디 생이 수지 매로다. 또 된디지 냥인 트렌다. 딘디기 람 깨지 땀 딘디 사버다 동의를 줘야기 땀 딘디 년디기 뺏고 등이 휴지 여배인데 생이 매지 디체인데 아니 디 사이봉부 야지 뒤기 차지를 막 주지 레버렸다 레제 아니 딘디기 담아든 거 쳐디 나라 예스다대야 아니 좀 딘디 구지디기 뺏 휴지 가지 날 때로시스 딜레로 땡메스 ngana kiran di karsa lula chaksir tamong lula chaksir tong kiran di tsubo ina ngi di tyong gi yinda yin se tsubor chaksir tong di tsuja ani dijela ni chedi shero da tandanga tawa kada gi pajesi soro de ngi damga de ma chedi song ba ni ba simji da korang goya gi damga de rawa odin lo jutu boda.
So there is this, another in the Jataka tales, there is this life where the Buddha narrates that he was surrounded by teachings and teachers who were just kind of talking about, or people, he was generally surrounded by people who were solely concerned with the well-being of this immediate life. And the Buddha at that point, he'd kind of become fed up with it. And so he was looking for someone who would teach him something that is just beyond this immediate life and immediate concern. And desperate to want something like this, he kept searching everywhere, but he couldn't find it. So he reached like a state of real thirst of wanting a teaching like this. And at that point, Indra kind of sends out a manifestation, and he says, I have the teachings that you want. And so the Buddha says, please give them to me. And he says, I can't give them to you so easily. First you have to, I think, justice and spike irola. So like a iron spike, you have to kind of poke that iron spike into your body 1,000 times, and when you do that, then I'll give you this teaching. But because the Buddha was so desperate and so desirous of that, he did. And then at that point, the teachings were given, which were like the 4 seals, and the Buddha was overjoyed at having received those teachings, despite the hardship that he had to endure. So yesterday, after the debate, when we did that blazing for the Dharma, you remember that thing? In that, if you remember, there's all these things that says that.
So the Sangye ki chue siksu jeba reri tuye ki che kawa shiu je yinsta. Di da kawa dis jeba di sonam ki tso di gen Sangye ki demba yuring neba juji se kaza melam di kyungu duwa.
So in that prayer that we did yesterday, it said, to hear one verse of the teachings of the Buddha, I have exerted myself in so many different ways. And through all of these efforts and difficulties and hardships that I've endured and the merit I've attained, may the teaching remain for long. That's what we were reciting yesterday.
Ta dindij to tensang se korbe. Tangbu gegen chi tengiru ba. So damga khari töndu nyegi ye. Di damga di ani gegen dizan yo bani gegen dizan damga di shu. Ta tögiru ba tö. Ta damga di tö sabe jela. Ta tadung susu loga di khasa. Yangyar ta damga shemba dili manga töyagi döba yoba da oda. Yang susu gi damga di tönda nenga khashi kogo ya dinde lama dizan damga mangu shu je. Yang mako da oda. Yang dili manga goba che lama dini raya mena. Yang ngazo lama shemba tenga rukshwa. Susu lama shemba tenga ruyundi. Ngama di tingje la tangje. Ani ngazo kolo jeba na shinshi, kolo nyingba di pa yukji ma yukji sawaji kyo. Yang sawa di nyingba shawa di yukji sawaji kyo nukuz do shayi jiruwa. Dos do di ngin tensan mango yorta. Di tensan dinde tong de mabushtuwa. Lama gibi shinji jikten, di zan damga kari shugugun shu. Damga dili tu, an tuba di susugi sam da gom kari chigini chi. Dini susugi tunda nenga mako wada, mazo wada, di chungba ina, yang gibishin shenpa tenga do shorta. Ta shenpa tenga do yundu, shenpa dini damga kugur. Damga di kuyungur. Damga yang ngar lama digma dima damga sawa kugure, tunda nenga sawa dini kugur. Kuyundu gana kodang tos mindawe keba yorta. Ta di lama dizala yang tangmun tendingi lama mangbo yorwa. Loma shenpa ki kowa dan, soso kowa dan, dende barula mindewe keba yorta. Keba dili yor. Ta keba di yoba hindu kana keba di karikani gyupare. Lana lama ngama ki damga digi ko gyuda masona chega ngweni sapsari dende ki damga ko lama sawaji tenche, damga ko tuye ki ko tunyena masona chega di lama ngama digi suesha yorta. Di lapsan hako tu urita, di lapsan hako tuwa che gugin rabu yorta. Ni ngama digi kadin tenyo ngachi. So zata lama dili damga saba tyongye chik cheche, di damga ten yundu, damga saba yinay susu la kogor wada. Kogo di shema mangbo chiki koma towa susu koya yungu duna, susu kotuye di kariki suyo kare. Nganzo kari samgo lana, ngama digi soba di chenpa je. Ngama digi ten shingi mindu, digi ten shingi kores, nganzo di konor di tepi duda. Ngama digi ten mashin, chima digi ten shingi koga mare. Chima digi ten yundu, susu tenu dionda, 민다고 고해디 ngama digi gyudu mason chega jangshawa sonza digi da kotuwa di chaba uda. Po du samtanya duwala. Tiyan ko nenga jireshiko.
So nowadays, I mean, maybe not nowadays, but there is this kind of tendency that is observable where people kind of rely on somebody, and then as you move forward, then you feel like you're not getting what you want, or you're not understanding what is being said, and so then you go and look elsewhere for a better or a different version, and so then you rely on another spiritual guide. But the way in which you rely on another spiritual guide kind of becomes almost like you discard the previous one as if you were done with them. So it's like kind of changing clothes where you had old clothes, you got rid of them because they're not useful for you anymore, and then you buy new clothes. With that kind of attitude of disregard or kind of, unconcern for the previous spiritual guide that you relied on, then you move on to someone else. Now when you do move on to someone else, you will hear something new. You might even understand something that you previously were unaware of. But the way that you're understanding it might be very different from how the other students of that same teacher are understanding the very same words. And if you do find yourself in that situation, the fact that you can understand and you are getting something new is not because your previous teacher was inadequate or incompetent or unable to do it. It's because the fact that you find yourself in a situation where you can now understand something newly was the previous one had kind of done all the groundwork or laid the entire foundation for you to be able to be receptive and understand and accommodate for that. So there is another way to look at this situation, which is where instead of considering our previous one as insufficient or inadequate or believing that they couldn't teach us or they were not good enough, and now we found someone who is better and who is good, and therefore this is the right person for us. If we don't think of it like this, but we understand that the previous ones have made us able to understand and they've done all the groundwork for us to be there and understand it, then you automatically recollect the kindness of the people that you've come from. So because this is like a thing that is noticed nowadays as an attitude that's developing, it's kind of, there's another way to look at it.
Authenticity. That domji kyomba inerta. Domji karikyo ilana. Kazan shuba nashire. Dungeni ngazo dego marbada. Dungeni ngazo dego meba yendu. Ani dunge dego me shendo dunge nargi yo sonza. Tangazo kawala yi songore islamna yi sunsa di kewalemba dil digma song se dela yi sunbachi sogugu yores ta di shebachi ta di soele bezun shegorwa ta di lapsan do siji kewalemba digi digmindu se ngunishina wangbu numbuchi na tuga rangshingi tuga jadung yosorobucher pena dajagi tumba sorobuchi imba ina chi gebu gegani machilol tuenje 아니 나베 동에 통 가베 동에 통 치베 동에 통 연디 딱 나야 치구구 요르베 나야 나구구 요르베 나야 가구구 요르베세도 구구 요레스라 연디 땅이 딘디 깨와지 가르친레는 레스지 랍상코로 깨월렘버 딘디 좋은 거에게 깨와디 렘버디 디그미 서지 랍상코로 딜로 뿡버다 딜로 통하지는 다 깨비 그 가르 딘디 깨고야지 가르쳐 버렸다 나고야 치고야 가고야 딘디기 깨와지 language gu khare sejani gudi samotang yundu di gudi manye shen di seju shin seju chege chedo ani korangi gyasi pang an tyo chen baro ta lama tenga doro da changsong shinagi la chenje changsong komja de su tungwa ni kebi gu khare res kewa khande se wor di changya chen do dero da so wangbu numbuji na korang shin tuga ja dong ro sto ta nganzu di tuga ja go maro da 나위 등은 되고 말에 가위 등은 되고 말에 치비 등은 되고 말에 이 누구보다 채와 되고 말에 미디어가 채버 되고 말에 이네들이 종이 깨로 잡대지 마도 딘디 용고에게 풍부딩이 가르친 렘버에서 디강랑 가서 투가자는 게고 말다 디 geb게 메워 손자 풍불림비 규카르레 세주시에게 삼로 지워들 리베 거르베로 디 풍불림비 규카르 세주시에게 제 메버 있나 아니 레더님은 풍부그 규레 자와 단징이 시고 디스케자 상망 안줄 데메 차로 대화 매주 차로 네 성문 계정 가지고 대화 매번 인도 아니 다른래 커두 강에 둥에도 직 커트인데 커두게 디 둥에도 세기 탑남로 땡이 정보에는 딜랑 가서 아니 항상 핸드업 토진 디월 죽친 안 대가점 대점신 가서 침진 당가도 누스 망아지고 누스 되고 왔다 손자 당가서 고야 가르스라나 둥에 탐지기 자와 풍보리 깨발렘버디 디기민도 세지다 디간라다 뿡야 여부지 쇠고 탕부디 디쇠 초바이나 랑싱기 셈나로 치월레고다 디디 가르친 렘버링이 깨와디디 가르친 렘버스 세기 ngazu do 미가셰 무즈페나 강했는데 지 가르쳐 그래. 다지 내가지 고점제 아니 강에 망고 쉬우지 체디 셔바이나 땅이 상모 고주서 니니 체송스다. 니 마시는 따다이 세지 니 체바디 디마 세지 상모 야풍에 되는 연구도다. 변한 조구지 겸겸 그래서 레가지 겸겸 조슬랍 아니 겸겸 조제 답견도 좋은 강과 차든지 강이 쉬우지 체바나다. 겸겸 말은 따다이 슬비도 간서다. 또 동해디 용사 니니 고주고 인디 드린디 만든 딱딱인데 가진 드라이나 세가지 깨지 셔 연구도 와다. 어디서라고 제정가서 나위 동해 다 동해기 남랑 가지 먹고 시기도 니 간디지 소소 서로와디 용어에 카도 될라 딘디 용고에기 풍부딩이 가진 렘버레스. 다디당이 휴지 노르드와 세게 셈바디 디간 뿡토바 이나다. 상만 디간라. 뿡토바 이나 다는게 전제에 대해서 라마지 요래. 딜라마디 콩 가든 디송거 그런 가지고 말해디 그런 로만 수 최수가 용들이 지금 가든 거 라마디 가든 디송거 랑기 당오마디 랑기 풍부디다스 풍부디 랑기 당오마디에서 가든 라마디 디송디 그런 로만 최수가 수요나 디송디 어디 된다 디송거 같다 어디시야 따딩가서 어디 풍부가나 뽕토나 아니 풍부림비 유카리 세 삼로 땅에 대다 다 풍부 매바지 중앙 오늘 대화를 도와서 여기 삼로디 랑싱기 용거리 딜레바이나 아니 양엘레 대바니 시와오세 깨제 딜레브르다 아니 신이 다 상계기 취열을 줘야기 남과 고체다 타발미야 고쪽도 그래 상계기 취역이 남과도 고체로다 다 디마통기 파도 아니 지단 개와 쌓아야 되는데 가리는 용초거리다 간다 상계비 취역이다 남과도 고체미 용고 잡셔 주더다. 어디 딩어도 하고 그러다.
So just to summarize, none of us want to suffer, but we continue to suffer. And even though we do continue to suffer, we don't always understand that the reason we're suffering is because we have taken birth. Some people who are exceptionally bright or with extremely sharp faculties, like the Buddha, they manage to make this connection right away. For instance, the Buddha, just by leaving the palace and seeing an aging man, a sick person, dead body, and asking whether he also had to go through this same process, when he was told that he does, he immediately was like, well, why am I in such a situation? Like, that came up immediately. And so, in the search of trying to find out why the Buddha has taken a birth or has these aggregates which are guaranteeing aging, sickness and death, then the Buddha set out to understand what the cause of that was, and when he was unable to find it, he leaves the palace behind and he goes relying on different teachers or seeking different teachers, always with the same question in mind, which is, what is the cause for my having taken this birth? And so people who are extremely sharp or have this ability, they can immediately make the connection by seeing the aggregates as a source of one's suffering and then being concerned with where it is coming from or what the cause of this is. The problem for us is we can't make that connection. And if we can't make that connection and we can't identify the aggregates as the cause of the suffering or as the nature of suffering and then be concerned or try and identify what the cause is, then all the discussion of this is the nature of suffering, these are the three kinds of suffering, it is caused by karma, it is caused by the afflictions, these become unnecessary, unrelated issues that we're not concerned with because we haven't yet understood that this is what the problem is. And at that point, if you can't make that connection, then whatever kind of solution you get or whatever method is given to you that provides immediate relief from whatever difficulty you might be facing becomes an incredible solution or becomes an incredible teaching. And so one gets very enamored or infatuated with these immediate relief techniques that we learn. And the reason why that happens is again because we haven't made the connection of the aggregates being the cause of suffering or the base of suffering, which then leads very naturally, automatically to to the next step, which is, and why do I have them? For example, we do this quite normally if we go for a walk with somebody, and on that walk we trip, fall, we break our leg. We do say, oh, I wish I'd never gone for that walk. Why did I step out for that walk? So it's natural that when we are faced with difficulty or we have a hard time, we always try and find or trace back the cause of that to the first moment, and then we say, oh my God, I wish that had never happened. Similarly, if we can identify the cause of suffering to be the aggregates, or just having the aggregates, then it becomes very natural to trace it, to want to figure out what the cause is. And so if one can identify the aggregates as the cause of whatever kind of suffering that might be, so the cause or the base of all our suffering is the aggregates, it naturally leads you to wonder, why do I have it, or what this cause is. So I have another Lama who I know, who always says this to whoever comes in. He always points to whoever comes in indiscriminately, not just to me, to everyone, and says, your aggregates are your enemy. This is just like his favorite thing. He says it to everybody. And so, if one makes this connection, then the third seal, which is, and therefore cessation or nirvana is peace, becomes something real. Because then you have, and you can understand that there is a way to be freed from this suffering. And if that is done, and one finds oneself in such a state, then at that point you can say that the doors to practicing dharma are open. Until that point they were closed, and whatever dharmic practice we've done, it's just an accumulation of virtue, and it is a virtuous action. But it hasn't really yet been able to open the door to enter into the path for practicing the dharma. Okay.